Hello everybody, recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 60 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, folks, this debrief is going to be in the top 60 for certain. We're going to talk about infrapubic angle, near the goods. That's what's going to be on docket for question number 1. Numero dos, we got manual ribcage work. When should you do that? How should you do that? Who, what, where, when, and why? Stay tuned because I'm going to answer all of those questions. And last but not least, we're going to talk about graded exposure. That's what's on docket for tonight's debrief. These are questions answered or asked from the people, answered for the people, by this people, fam recognized fam. Before I dive in, folks, ladies and gentlemen, do you struggle getting your patients or your clients moving the way you want to? Do you have people who hurt multiple areas and you're uncertain what to do or where to start? Are you coaching someone to deadlift and despite your best efforts you can't get it right? Well, folks, I have a solution for you, and it's in the form of the Human Matrix. There's 3 of them this year, September 15th and 16th, aka next week. The first one is going down. There are still tickets available. It is in Seattle, Washington, October 27th to 28th in KCMO. Whoa! That's Kansas City, Missouri, if you're not a Tekanina fan. And last but not least, November 10th and 11th will be in Portland, Oregon. We will be providing you guys updates as to how the course is flowing coming from Seattle. Without further ado, folks, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Angus. That's a dope name. Angus asks, "Hi Zach, in one of your recent videos, you talked about infrasternal and infrapubic angles being similar, typically. Stay tuned on that. What is the relationship between hamstring and adductor when focusing on either for infrasternal angle?" Angus, it's an unbelievable question. Let me try my best to answer it for you. Actually, I'll do better than your best. I got my model here. So the infrapubic angle, what is that? I'm glad you asked. Find the pubic symphysis, which is this guy right here in the middle. So you got your 2 innominates, and then there's this little cartilaginous thing linking them together. That's your pubic symphysis. If you dive just south of that, or inferior, if you want to get all anatomical on me, which you should, you're going to see this little angle of the pubis right here. This would be infrapubic angle, this angle right here. So the pubis is part of the innominate, and then just below that, that angle is your infrapubic angle. Now, under normal respiratory conditions, whenever we see that, what should happen is, as I take a breath of air in, the infrasternal angle should widen because that creates the bucket handle action of the lower ribs. As that happens, if we go downstairs, which we will, the infrapubic angle ought to narrow. Because what that does is, as the infrapubic angle narrows, this is during inhalation, the pelvic floor or the pelvic diaphragm drops down and descends in order to catch the goods. So I get pressing down of the diaphragm up top, which pushes all the goods downstairs. Pelvic diaphragm descends to catch them, and then everything is flip-flopped in exhalation. So in that case, the pelvic floor ascends, which causes a relative widening of the infrapubic angle, and then the bucket handle action decreases to expel air out, which would narrow the infrasternal angle. This is normal respiratory conditions. Under those circumstances, the angles, infrasternal and infrapubic, should not match. That also is true in gait, because as I go over to one side, I need things to piston up, so the diaphragm, both diaphragms to ascend. If in my swing phase, I need both diaphragms to descend. But of course, we're not dealing with normal half the time because a lot of the fam have movement limitations present. If there are movement limitations present, especially in the thoraco-abdominal pelvic region, then you might suspect that instead of that opposing relationship between the infrasternal and infrapubic angle during the respiratory cycle, we have a matchup. So if I have a wide infrasternal angle, typically that's associated with a wider infrapubic angle. That has to do with what occurs at the sacrum and actually the entire exoskeleton for that matter. If I have a narrow infrasternal angle, the infrapubic angle ought to be narrow as well. That's typically the relationship, because when I have that matching, typically due to, what's the word I'm looking for? Compensatory activity, movement limitations will occur when that strategy is being utilized. What are some key muscles to consider for these presentations? And I'll go through each. In the narrow let's start with wide. In the wide infrapubic angle, as you can see, when I widen the IPA, the pubic ramus, the inferior pubic ramus, and the ischial tuberosity move a lot closer to the femur. Or I can do the same thing by moving the femur a lot closer to the innominate. That would be hip adduction. So to talk about your adductor portion of the relationship, if I am a wide infrapubic angle, because the attachments of the adductors, which are on the lower portion of the pubis and on the femur, are closer together, there is a concentric orientation present with those guys. What that means is that you're going to probably have a limitation in hip abduction because my adductors can't chill. These guys are concentrically active. I can have them go eccentrically because the adductors are trying to pull this relationship closer and closer together. If we flip-flop that with a narrow infrapubic angle, here the infrapubic angle is narrow, and you can see that the pubis portion of the innominate is moving further away from the femurs. Okay. What that's going to do is create an eccentric orientation of the adductors. So guess what? A lot of times these people, not always, but a lot of times these people actually have crazy amounts of abduction or flow because of the eccentric orientation of the adductors. I don't have something that's kicking on so hard concentrically that will limit motion. What you typically have in that case is the reverse, which would be a concentric orientation of the hip abductors, so think gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, and that creates a potential limitation into hip adduction. Now you'd think, well Zach, if that's the case, and I flip-flop the orientation and I go back to my wide infrapubic angle, I should probably be able to adduct the femur. You'd think that, but there's a problem. And the problem has to do with the axial skeleton in this case. Because the axial skeleton is always going to govern the relative orientation of these innominates. If you look into some of the research, and I'll try to link some stuff in the show notes, the SI joint does not have much movement. Millimeters we're talking, and it possibly fuses on in later in life. So the SI mechanics would beget that if I get a posterior rotation of the innominate, which is associated with a wide infrapubic angle, so to widen the angle, I'm going to dip the innominate posteriorly. That's associated with a nutation of the sacrum. Now here's the tricky part. As the sacrum nutates, and let's say I get an increase in lumbar lordosis, which is typically associated with sacral nutation, this whole bad boy, the pelvis, is going to be oriented, or tilted if you want to kick it old school, anteriorly. What that's going to do is that's going to bias muscles on the front side, think maybe your hip flexors, which might limit your ability to extend the hip into a test position to test adduction. Maybe that's actually what you're dealing with. Potentially some of the hip adductors could get leverage if there's some type of compensatory activity at the femur, which could also be a contributing factor to adduction. So it's not necessarily cut and dry that I have a wide IPA and I can adduct, and I have a narrow IPA and I cannot adduct. A lot of it depends on the relative motions that occur at the sacrum, at the innominates, and of course at the femur. That's what you're using your testing to guide. But for our intents and purposes, from a treatment standpoint, If I have a wide infrapubic angle, think adductors concentrically active. If I have a narrow infrapubic angle, adductors are eccentrically active or oriented. From a hamstring standpoint, that's a little tricky because I can need hamstrings or have a various orientation of the hamstrings depending on the relative motion that I was discussing. So for example, if I just widen the IPA, that creates a posterior rotation of the innominate, which actually would probably give some concentric leverage to the proximal hamstrings because I'm going into a posterior rotation, and that is one of the actions of the hammies. But if the sacrum tilts us way, way forward anteriorly, or in anterior orientation, those hamstrings lose leverage, so then they become eccentrically oriented. And then what happens? Well, if I get eccentric orientation of the hamstrings, then I might actually have a crazy amount of straight leg raise as a possibility. Or actually, I would potentially be limited. It really depends on the relative motions. So if I widen the IPA, what can happen is I will get a relative concentric orientation of the hamstrings, but then as this dips forward, that becomes an eccentric orientation of the hamstrings. Not necessarily desirable. With the narrow infrapubic angle, I can have very similar things happen. If this angle narrows, and I get an anterior rotation of the innominates, that could create an eccentric orientation of the hamstrings. And then if the relative motion leads to a way crazy nutation and I get into this position where I'm actually more posteriorly oriented, I get a concentric orientation of the hamstrings. The point being, with all of this, is you have to look at your testing algorithm, whatever that is, see what fits and what you need to do, and make decisions based off that. That's what we're going to go into next. If I have a wide infrasternal angle and I have movement limitations, you can safely make the assumption that the infrapubic angle is also wide. What are the changes that you might have to make in this case to effectively target this intervention or target this area? It all has to do with the ball. If I'm using, say, a hook line, 90-90, or whatever position, what I may do is I may just use the ball as a placeholder and not squeeze super hard. Why do you think that is? Well, the answer, folks, has to do with concentric orientation of the adductors. If I have that, I don't want to squeeze the ball because what that may do is that may reinforce the infrapubic angle widening. Not necessarily a good thing. On the flip-flop, or the flip side, if I'm narrow with the ball, I would most certainly want to squeeze the ball because what that would do is that would open up the infrapubic angle because my adductors in this case are eccentrically oriented. Hamstrings, for both of these people, are actually pretty beneficial because the relative orientation of both cases, a narrow IPA and a wide, both are oriented anteriorly. So you can use the hamstrings to normalize the orientation of the pelvis to a degree. Because the hamstrings, one, are not as good of hip extenders from 0 beyond. That's where glute max might come into play, and that's where I'm utilizing a lot of glute max stuff. I will link the hip extension debrief to clarify that a little bit more. But that's where they're both important. What the ball serves to do, though, is it biases certain hamstrings along with the adductors, depending on whether you're squeezing or not. In the wide case, a lot of times this is associated with externally rotated femurs. If I don't do anything between my knees, the biceps femori are going to have a lot more leverage than the medial hamstrings. We need them all to pull this guy back into a normal position. Scare quotes for days. In the narrow case, this case, I would not have as much biceps femoris activity because typically this might be associated with an internal rotation of the femurs. For those individuals, what I may do is I may squeeze the ball, So I can get, actually, no, I misspoke in that regard. Femoral, oh, thank you, Jordan. So in this case, I do have internal orientation of the femurs, but I'm squeezing the ball so I can get the infrapubic angle normalized. It doesn't have as much of the hamstring component as I would say with the wide infrapubic angle. So those would be some of the treatment considerations that I would think about with a wide versus a narrow. To summarize between those two, really the biggest difference is whether you squeeze the ball or not. In the wide, you're probably not. In the narrow, you most certainly are, and that has to do with orientation of the adductors. Hamstrings are important in both cases because it helps normalize the orientation of the pelvis, and if you do that, you should be in business. Now, the one piece that I didn't talk about is whether if I have an asymmetrical infrapubic angle, which typically would be narrow on the left, wide on the right. That has to do with the organ asymmetry that we have, not just the heart, the liver, but also the guts, as well as the pelvic stuff, the goods. For that, basically what you're going to do is do narrow IPA things on the left, wide IPA things on the right. A lot of times what I do, just from a convenience sake, is I will treat that individual as a narrow IPA to start. And the reason why that is because if you think about it, this pelvic diaphragm is way more descended than the opposite, so I need to try to account for that first and foremost. It's just much simpler in that regard. All that being said, you can also do a lot of unilateral activities with these people. But typically most people have bilateral limitations. So from my standpoint, it makes a heck of a lot more sense just to treat them either as a bilaterally narrow IPA to start. And then once you do that, a lot of times, depending on what test limitations remain, if any, you can bias your approach in that regard. So to summarize the biggest points, guys, narrow IPA, you want adductors with a wide. You do not want adductors, and if they're asymmetrical, give them adductors on the left, maybe not so much on the right. And if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question, Angus. Whew, that was like the longest explanation ever, but I hope you guys liked it. Next question comes from Ben. Hi, Zach. With the belly breather, flat chest population, do you like any manual chest wall work to help get that open and filling better? It seems tough to get good chest wall expansion on those people with just exercise sometimes. Thanks. Ben, you're welcome. Ever since I attended the intensive by Daddy-O Pops, Bill Hartman, I'll link him in the show notes if you don't know who that is. If you don't, shame on you. He's a good person. Ever since I've attended that, though, I've been definitely doing a lot more manual work than I was in the past. And I think the reason why manual work on the ribcage is important is because it's really tough to get people to feel where they need to put their ribcage as they're going through the breath cycle. If I want to create the 360 or the multi-directional expansion in this body cavity, I need to be super duper good at keeping the lower ribcage closed. What that does is allows for the diaphragm to ascend, allows for me to bucket handle effectively, as well as get the pump handle and posterior thorax expansion. A lot of people have a hard time getting there on their own, especially if they're wide, because they might not be able to get enough concentric leverage of their abdominals to make a favorable change. What you have to do for these people is push on the ribs. If you do that, that can work wonders. Now, you can be even more targeted than that if you understand where that person is limited and where they actually need to drive air. For example, and I dive into this a little bit more in the movement debrief, or actually in the human matrix, but I do have a few debriefs that talk about shoulder motion limitations. I'll link that in the show notes, which will be available on the site tomorrow. But here's what I want you to consider with that. Generally, if I can't fill the anterior portion of the chest wall, that will be associated with internal rotation limitations. It has to do with the relative orientation that the scapula goes into, as well as the humerus that biases certain muscles to create that limitation. If I think about it this way, if I can't fill air in, this has to clamp down, or this is more clamped down. the humerus has to right to center in a certain manner, and that creates a limitation, right? If I otherwise can fill up the front, but maybe I don't fill up the back, that puts the scapula into relative retracted orientation. The humerus has to compensate accordingly. That can lead to an external rotation limitation. So, if you are seeing IR limitations, they probably can't fill the front. If it's ER limitations, they probably can't fill the back. What's the fix? I'm glad you asked. I don't get super duper sexy with my manual techniques for the ribcage. I call it the common sense certification when you're employing these manual techniques on a ribcage. And all that entails is wherever they can't fill, you literally physically close down all the other areas and force them to fill into that area. I'll give you an example. Let's say I cannot fill my right chest wall, and that is because I have an IR limitation. So you pick that up, and maybe you've done some stuff to normalize the infrasternal angle, but that's still limited. What you would do in this case is an activity that closes down on the opposite side, and maybe this side as well, if you got two people. Close it down there, and then just force them to breathe into that position. If I don't allow the ribs to expand in those areas that are blocked, air's got to go somewhere. A lot of times it's there. Another sneaky one that I like, if I have someone who, let's say, was narrow, and I open up the right side, but they're still closed on the left, I will literally put their hands crossed over like this, block them down here, put another hand pressed down here, and then just force them to bucket handle on that side. And you'd be amazed what that does. If it's posterior thorax, pull their arm, close down on the front, don't let them breathe by pressing down here, and have them inhale. Whatever areas they can't get air in, close off the areas they can, and force them to breathe there, suffocate your people. It works, one way or another. That's really the simplest way that I've been looking at manual therapy for the ribcage at this point. It's not rocket surgery, as Lorimer Mosley's daughter would say. To summarize, I do find that manual ribcage work is incredibly impactful. I'm a big fan. What you do is once you've determined where they can't fill air in, which is typically done by checking internal and external rotation, you can't ER, you can't get it in the back, you can't IR, you can't get it in the front. If the infrasternal angle is wide or narrow, fix that. But wherever they're limited, press down on the non-limited areas, force them to put air into the area that is limited. And if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question, Ben. All right, the last question comes from Lucy. Lucy asks, yo, what it do, Big Z? What are your opinions on graded exposure? Do people in chronic pain suffer through pain when they learn? Do people in chronic pain need to suffer through pain when they learn new activities? Is this something that they have to get used to? Lucy, this is a great question. And I might be a little controversial on it. I might not be. So let's break this down piece by piece. What is graded exposure, first and foremost? Graded exposure is the foundation to everything we do in the health and performance realm. When I am trying to get better at a squat, let's say I'm front squatting, I start with 135 or whatever the poundage is that I decide to start with. I struggle with that, and then what happens is I create an adaptation and that becomes easier. So then what I will do to improve myself is I will expose myself to either more reps, more weight, more load, whatever. That would be graded exposure in that context. A lot of times, graded exposure is talked about more so in persistent or chronic pain states. And what that would be, or what that would entail, is you take someone who is dealing with persistent pain in a given activity or activities, and you slowly expose them to that stimulus more and more in a non-painful or minimally painful environment, and with the intent being able to get them to do more and more activity without pain. A practical example, let's say you are in chronic pain or you're persistent pain somewhere, I don't care, but it's impacted when you vacuum your entire house. When you vacuum your entire house, What happens is you are out cold for 3 days and you can't do much of anything. What you would do in that case then is, instead of vacuuming the entire house, you might coach that individual to section it off. Hey, instead of vacuuming all 4 rooms in your house, I want you to just do 1 room. We do that, test, see how they do. Hey, you know what? That wasn't too bad. I wasn't laid out. Cool. Then I can progress to room 2, and then maybe I do 3 rooms. Up 3 rooms, I had a 1-day flare up. No big. We're going to do 2.5, and then you would build up until the whole house can be vacuumed, as a practical example. That obviously is very individualized in terms of the durations and how you progress and regress that person accordingly. So that would be graded exposure. The thing, though, that's very interesting is, do people in chronic pain suffer through pain when they have to learn new activities? Some individuals or proponents of graded exposure would say that a little bit of pain is okay. I personally am not a big fan of that, with a little asterisk to that. Let me unpack that for you. When I have an individual who is experiencing pain in a given movement, the pain then can potentially become a learned behavior with that specific task. What I don't want to do is reinforce that learned behavior, because what happens is when they go do, say, a squat, and the pain neurotag, so the areas of the brain that fire when the pain experience occurs, is set off, I need to find a way to sneak attack around that. Maybe that's something as simple as, I don't know, coaching the movement so it looks pretty. I think that's one thing a lot of people don't do enough. I need to make these movements look good so the joints are in good positions and orientations, so I'm getting maximum muscular activity to help meet my goals in that regard. You have to do that. And I think a lot of just in my profession's case, and I'm not blaming the profession, I'm blaming the educational system, but a lot of coaching is not taught in PT school with a lot of the basic movements. So having a fine-tuned coach's eye is incredibly important when you're working with people in persistent pain. Because if you can eliminate that pain by just tweaking how they do a particular movement, well, then who gives a shit about graded exposure? You got them moving, you got them doing so pain-free, they're in business. Build their fitness, and life should be good. Now, is some pain okay, though? Let's say you've done that, you've coached it, and they're still hurting. For me personally, I don't try to push the envelope too much in that regard, depending on what my goal is. If my goal, for example, let's use the squat. Let's say they have pain with squatting, and I'm just trying to build lower extremity fitness or just get them generally conditioned. I can pick several other variations of either that movement or another movement like a deadlift that could get me very similar results. Do I need to force that person to go through pain to, I don't know, gradedly expose themselves to the task? Maybe it's just the wrong pick for them. Or how about this? Maybe it's the wrong pick for them today. I've had several people where, there's one case that stands out to me in particular, but I had a woman who I was seeing post-op ACL, and we had her doing step-ups, and on Monday I saw her, let's say, they hurt despite my best efforts at coaching, and it looked really good. So I'm like, we don't need to push through this. You're probably not getting the physiological benefits that I want. Let's hold off. When I saw her on Thursday, she was able to do it pain-free. I didn't change anything. So it may be that this move is painful today and it's not the right pick. It may also be that it's just not right the right move for that person in general. That would be another thing to consider. Also another thing to consider would be, if we've talked about coaching and we've talked about potentially using a different task, altering, actually those would be the biggest things I would say, is you either have to alter the way that they're performing the task or give them a different task to do that. And I think you can build conditioning, build fitness, and build resiliency and get people moving without having to push through pain. Because if they're feeling pain, they're probably not getting the physiological benefits that you're going after. Now, in the case of, say, someone who has pain at all times, let's say they have pain at rest, what I will coach for those people is not that you shouldn't feel any pain during this activity because they always feel pain. But for those individuals, what I will say is, hey, if this is your baseline level, let's say it's a 4 out of 10. I don't use the numbers, but for the sake of argument, it's a 4 out of 10. I don't want you to go above 4 out of 10 with this particular activity. And a lot of times you can, using the stuff I employed before, coaching movements well and picking movements that a client can do, you can get someone moving and moving well and not raise their pain levels. Now, a case where it gets a little hairy is someone who might not have pain right at the moment of activity, but will have a lot of pain afterwards. I have someone like that right now, and I made a boo-boo with him with our second session because he was feeling pretty good. I was pushing him pretty hard, and he just, came out of surgery, and he came to me this week and was like, hey man, I was really hung up for the last few days. And he felt nothing within session. For those people, it's a matter of graded exposure, but you also have to time or grade the total volume or amount of activity that someone goes to. And in that case, unfortunately, it's a little bit of trial and error, but you pick a certain amount of an activity that you're going to do or activities, see how they respond, make sure that there's no flare-ups that happen. For example, if they're sore the rest of the day maybe, but they're fine the next day, cool. Then I think we're in business and you can progress from that. You may even say, hey, we're gonna stick with this amount of sets and reps until you don't get that little flare-up towards the end of the day. It really depends on what that person can tolerate or what you feel comfortable pushing them through. So in the PT setting, I'm not a big fan of pushing people through pain or into pain if we can avoid it. If we can teach them to move without pain, then you are de-threatening the movement, you're building fitness, they're likely moving the areas that you need to work, and everyone's happy. In the case where I talked about the vacuuming, doing graded exposure in that regard, what I usually tell people when they're doing stuff out and about, because things have to get done, right? The house has to get vacuumed, I get it. For those individuals, I tell them to treat pain as a house. You want to knock on the door of the house. So you can vacuum, and if it hurts a little bit, that's okay. Maybe just back off a little bit, chill, wait a little bit, and then resume your vacuuming. What I don't want to do is I don't want to bust down the door, which would be pushing through pain. That's the problem, because when that happens, the brain perceives that we are in a state of high alert. There's a large amount of threat. I could potentially hurt myself and pain can increase. But I also don't want to play in the lawn, so to speak, because if I do that, what happens is I lose fitness because I'm not moving as much as I should, and then when shit hits the fan and I have to go vacuum, because shit hit the fan and it's all over, bad joke. But if that happens and I have to vacuum, then I'm not physically prepared to do so, and then you run into problems. So to summarize on graded exposure, in the fitness and the PT realm, I'm not a fan of pushing people through pain when we're moving them, because pain becomes a learned behavior with the movement task. That can be a problem because I want to get our people coaching and moving without pain, or moving without pain, I should say. Also, if I am experiencing pain within a movement task, I'm probably not getting all the physiological benefits that I'm trying to go for. That's another thing to consider. So what you need to do is alter the movement so it's pain-free, or you need to pick movements that person can do without pain. That's building fitness. From that point, what I would say is if you're doing graded exposure from daily tasks, use the house analogy. I want people to knock on the door of pain. They can touch it, tease it, just don't push way past it. I don't want you to bust the door down, but I also don't want you to play in the lawn. Thank you, Lucy, for an unbelievable question. Fam, recognize fam. That's a good stopping point for us tonight. I happen to lose Facebook again, so I will not belabor them with all the goodies that I normally say, but I thank you on Instagram, so much for tuning in. If you want to learn more, here's where you can find me. Go to zachcouples.com. You'll want to subscribe to my newsletter while you're there. What you're going to get from my newsletter is a lot of stuff, but you're going to get me talking for about 4.5 hours. About 3 of those hours are going to be on breathing, About an hour and a half of that is going to be on pain, like really super cool stuff. You're going to get 50 pages of notes from that stuff. You're going to get a free, yes, free acute chronic workload calculator. Incredibly useful if you want to safely progress loading, maybe for your people who have persistent pain. How about that? Graded exposure with science. Also, every Friday I will send you weekend learning goodies. What will happen with that is you'll find whatever I found that week that's pretty cool on the internet that you should probably give a shot. Once you've done that, go to the online services page. There's 3 things we can do as colleagues. I can either help you from a movement consultation, especially if you're toy and not moving as well as you'd like to, or if you are, if you saw a bunch of people, you're not sure what's going on, maybe if I move a little bit better, I might feel a little bit better, or you know what, maybe, I don't know, my split squat just feels terrible, and I want someone to check that out. I can be your guy. Definitely hit me up with a movement consultation. Also, I offer mentoring. If you want to better understand how to apply the infrapubic angle stuff that we talk about with your people, you want to dive deeper into that, if you will. If maybe you want to work on graded exposure with your peeps and learn how to apply that in an effective manner that's minimally painful or pain-free, I can be your guy for that. Definitely hit me up for mentoring. The last thing, if you want just straight gains, if you want me to apply some of the principles that I discussed with you today in your own training program, especially if you're post-rehab, I will work with you. We will write monthly programs, we'll chat back and forth, we'll adjust accordingly, make sure you get your gains, and win at life. Definitely hit me up for online training. Once you've done that, you'll want to go to iTunes and Stitcher, search the Zach Couples Show, because guess what, folks? There's 59 other debriefs you probably might want to listen to, especially if you don't want to look at me all that time. I wouldn't. Other places you can find me, facebook.com/ZCouples. The Twitter handle is also @ZCouples. On that Instagram, baby, we got Zach, ZAC, Couples, CUPPLES. And if you search YouTube for Zach Couples, you'll find me. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You've been amazing, beautiful, sexy, outstanding people. I want you to keep it real, but not to the extent when things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.